The heavy courtroom door slammed shut behind him with a dull thud. The sound echoed through the cold, sterile room, bouncing off the white walls and the cold marble floors. A sense of finality hung in the air, suffocating everything in its wake. He stood there, his feet firmly planted on the floor, as the weight of the moment crushed him. 60 years, the judge had said. His words cut through the room like a blade, sharper than the gavel he now held in his hand. 60 years. The number rolled over his mind like a haunting echo. It felt surreal, as if it were happening to someone else. How could this be? How could he, someone who had never broken the law, who had spent his whole life doing what was right, end up here, sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars? His mind raced, trying to grasp what had just happened. He had pleaded his case. He had begged for justice. But the courtroom had been deaf to his cries. The prosecutor's words, sharp and pointed, had struck him down. The witnesses, with their fabricated testimonies, had painted him as the villain. There was no evidence to back up the charges. No fingerprints, no DNA, no clear motive. Nothing. Yet here he was, shackled and broken, as the world seemed to collapse around him. He tried to look at the judge, but the words he had spoken continued to ring in his ears, drowning out everything else. 60 years. His knees felt weak, as though they could give out at any moment. His body, once strong and capable, now felt like a prisoner to his own fate. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, judging, pitying, condemning. His life had just been rewritten in a single moment. His heart beat erratically, and his breath quickened as the reality of his situation began to sink in. Was this really happening? Was he truly about to spend the next 60 years in a cell, away from everything and everyone he had ever known? The thought of it made him dizzy. He closed his eyes, hoping to escape the nightmare, but there was no escape. Not from this. The guards were already approaching him, their cold hands reaching for his arms, pulling him toward the door. He didn't resist. What was the point? The fight had already been lost. He walked in a daze, his legs moving on their own, his mind far away from the present moment. How could this have happened? How had it all gone so wrong? Outside the courtroom, he could hear the sounds of his family breaking down. His mother's sobs were the loudest, piercing through the heavy silence that had descended over him. His father stood frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide in disbelief. His friends, who had sat through the entire trial in a mix of confusion and anger, were shaking their heads, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. He could feel their eyes on him, but it was as though they were miles away, their voices muffled by the pounding in his own head. As the doors closed behind him, he was led down a long, narrow hallway toward the holding cells. The guards walked with purpose, their footsteps echoing against the walls, but all he could hear was the rush of blood in his ears. His world was spinning, and every step he took felt like an eternity. He could feel the weight of the cuffs around his wrists, biting into his skin, a constant reminder of the life that had just been ripped from him. The silence in the hallway was suffocating. Every corner, every turn, seemed to close in on him. He could feel the cold air, sharp against his skin, like a warning. The walls felt closer now, as if they were pressing in on him, trapping him in this nightmare that was no longer just a nightmare, it was his reality. They reached the cell block, and the guards shoved him into a small, dark room. It smelled of damp concrete and stale air. There was a cot in the corner, a thin blanket draped over it, and a small toilet in the far corner. It was a room meant to break you, to strip away everything that made you human and reduce you to nothing more than a number. The door clanged shut behind him, locking with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine. For a moment, he stood still, unsure of what to do. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. The reality of his situation was hitting him with full force now. 60 years. That was how long he would spend in this place. No hope. No future. No freedom. He collapsed onto the cot, the springs creaking under his weight. His mind raced, but there was no clarity. Just a jumbled mess of thoughts. What had happened? How had he been convicted of something he didn't do? What was the truth? A loud bang on the bars startled him. He looked up, blinking against the harsh light that flooded the room. A guard stood there, staring at him with a look of indifference. "You'll get your dinner in a few hours," the guard said, his voice flat and uncaring. "Thanks," he whispered, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. There was no gratitude in him. Only a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal. As the guard walked away, he lay back on the cot, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts swirled like a tornado, each one pulling him further into confusion. His family. His friends. Everyone he had ever loved or known. How could they all believe this lie? How could they think he was capable of something so horrible? He closed his eyes, trying to push away the tears that were threatening to fall. No. He wouldn't cry. Not now. Not here. Not for them. He would hold on to his dignity. He would fight. He had to. The question burned in his chest: what was the truth? What had really happened? There had to be something he was missing. He had to find it. If not for himself, then for the people who had stood by him, the ones who believed in him. They couldn't know the truth if he didn't uncover it. The hours dragged on in silence, each minute stretching into eternity. His mind never stopped racing, even when his body was exhausted. He knew that there was more to this than what he had been told. This wasn't just a random mistake. There was something more sinister at play, something far beyond the courtroom and the lies they had fed him. He could feel it. It was out there, waiting to be discovered. As the night fell, he found himself staring out the small window in his cell. The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light shining down like a distant hope. It felt like the only thing left in this world that still had meaning. A silent promise, perhaps, that the truth would come to light. That he would survive this. But how? How would he uncover the truth in a place like this? How could he even begin to fight when the system itself had failed him? He didn't know. But he would find a way. He had to. His heart was heavy, but his resolve was stronger than ever. 60 years. That's what they had sentenced him to. But they hadn't counted on one thing. He wasn't going down without a fight. And this fight? It was just beginning. The days blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the last. Time moved slowly in the prison, as if the minutes themselves were reluctant to pass. The walls were a constant reminder of his new reality, their cold stone faces staring back at him with indifference. He had learned to ignore the whispers and jeers of the other inmates, their voices always laced with mockery or venom. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut that something wasn't right. His life had been stolen from him, but there was something deeper at play, a mystery far beyond the conviction that had brought him here. Every night, when the lights dimmed and the hum of the prison died down, he would lie on the cot, staring up at the dark ceiling. His thoughts would race, spiraling out of control. What if there was someone out there who could help him? What if he was just a pawn in a much larger game? The thought haunted him, refusing to let him rest. He had to find answers, no matter the cost. He spent the next few weeks in a haze. His only focus was surviving the daily grind of prison life. The food was terrible, the days long, and the guards distant, offering him nothing but occasional glares or insults. But he kept to himself, refusing to engage in any of the petty bickering or violence that often erupted among the other inmates. He couldn't afford distractions. His mind had a singular purpose now, to figure out what had really happened. It was during a routine lunch break that the first clue appeared. He had been sitting at the small, scratched-up table in the mess hall, pushing his food around his tray, his appetite long gone. His mind was too preoccupied with thoughts of how to uncover the truth, how to prove his innocence, to focus on the bland meal before him. That's when he noticed the man across the table. He was an older inmate, his face weathered and lined with the hardships of prison life. His eyes were sharp, though, always observing, always calculating. He had a reputation. He was known for being able to find out things, secrets that no one else could. People called him, the Watcher. It was said that he could gather information just by listening, just by watching the way people moved or spoke. The Watcher had been eyeing him for days now, but today, there was something different in his gaze. There was curiosity in those dark eyes, a flicker of something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The man leaned in closer, his voice low and gravelly. "You don't belong here," he said, his words cutting through the noise of the crowded mess hall. He tensed, instinctively pulling away. "What do you mean?" The Watcher's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You've got the look of a man who's been wronged. A man who doesn't fit the profile of a convict. They've got you in here for a reason, but I don't think you did what they said." His pulse quickened. How did this man know? How could he possibly know the truth? But he couldn't show fear. He couldn't reveal the doubts that had been festering in his mind for weeks. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his voice low. "What are you saying?" The Watcher's gaze flicked around the room, ensuring no one was listening. "I'm saying there's more to your case than what you've been told. Much more. I've seen men like you before, men who were thrown in here because someone needed to cover something up." He swallowed hard, his heart racing. Was this a sign? Was it possible that someone else knew? Someone who could help him? The Watcher's eyes locked onto his. "You're not the first innocent man to end up in this place. But if you want to get out, if you want to survive, you're going to have to dig deeper. People like you, they don't just end up here by accident. They're pushed. And there's always someone who benefits." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. He stared at the man, unsure whether to trust him, unsure if this was just another inmate trying to get under his skin. But there was something about the Watcher's words that rang true. He had always felt like something was off, like the case against him was too neat, too convenient. "Who's behind it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The Watcher gave him a cryptic smile. "That, my friend, is something you'll have to figure out for yourself. But I'll give you a little advice: start by looking at who gains from your conviction." With that, the man stood up, leaving his unfinished meal behind. He walked away without another word, disappearing into the sea of inmates, leaving him alone with his thoughts. For the rest of the day, his mind raced. Who stood to gain from his imprisonment? The idea gnawed at him. He had always assumed that the justice system was impartial, that the truth would eventually come to light. But now, doubts clouded his mind. What if there was more to it? What if someone, somewhere, had fabricated the entire case against him for their own gain? That night, after the lights had gone out and the prison fell silent, he began to think more deeply about the Watcher's words. There had to be something he could do. He couldn't just sit in this cell and wait to rot away. He had to find a way to uncover the truth. But where could he even begin? The next few days were a blur of routine, mornings spent in the yard, afternoons in the cafeteria, and long hours in his cell, lying awake, thinking. It was during one of these long nights that he made a decision. He would start by looking into the people who had been involved in his case. He would examine every detail, no matter how small, and find the crack in the story. Because the truth had to be out there. It had to be. He began his search by revisiting the trial. The details were fuzzy in his mind, but he knew the basics. The prosecution had been relentless, building a case against him that seemed airtight. There were witnesses who had testified against him, people who swore they had seen him at the scene of the crime. But none of it made sense. He had never been in the area where the crime occurred. He had an alibi, but no one had seemed to care. The prosecution's star witness had been a man named Robert. Robert had claimed to have seen him leaving the scene. But as he thought back to the trial, a question arose in his mind: why had Robert's testimony been so easily accepted? Why had no one questioned it? The next morning, he asked around the yard, hoping to find someone who might have known Robert or who might have information about the trial. It was slow going. Most of the inmates were either too busy with their own struggles or too wary of getting involved in anything that might bring trouble. But eventually, he managed to track down a man who had been in the courtroom during his trial. The man, whose name was Carl, had been sitting in the back, far from the center of the action. Carl was hesitant to speak at first, but after a few moments of conversation, he relented. "I remember that witness, Robert," he said. "Something about him didn't sit right. I don't know why, but he seemed too sure of himself. Like he was playing a part." That was the first crack. Something about Robert didn't sit right with Carl either. He had seen it too, an air of confidence that wasn't natural for a man who claimed to have witnessed a crime. There was something deeper at play, something that no one had noticed. But he couldn't put his finger on it just yet. Carl leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "I heard rumors. There's talk that Robert wasn't exactly a stranger to the police." His heart raced. Robert was involved in something more than just the trial. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together. But what did it mean? Who had put him up to this? As Carl walked away, leaving him with more questions than answers, he knew one thing for sure: he was getting closer. The truth was out there, and he was determined to find it. No matter what it took. The cold air in the prison yard cut through him as he walked in slow, measured steps. He had begun to realize that time no longer moved in the same way for him. Each second felt stretched, each moment held with the weight of something crucial about to unfold. The whispers of the watcher's words echoed in his mind: "Look at who gains from your conviction." Now, more than ever, he understood the significance of those words. But still, the pieces didn't fit. He had more questions than answers. Robert's testimony had always seemed suspicious, but the idea that someone might have manipulated the entire case against him, it was almost too much to bear. Could it really be true? Could the entire criminal justice system have been compromised? He sat on one of the cold metal benches in the yard, staring out at the fence that separated him from the outside world. The watcher had given him a piece of advice, but it was vague and cryptic. Look at who gains. But what did that really mean? What was there to gain from his conviction? He had spent hours poring over every detail he could remember from the trial. He had tried to recall every name, every witness, every piece of evidence. But it was like trying to piece together a shattered mirror: some fragments made sense, while others remained lost in the darkness. The more he thought about it, the more unsettling the situation became. The prison yard was quieter than usual. He watched the other inmates interact, some arguing over a game of basketball, others huddled in small groups talking about whatever passed for entertainment in a place like this. He didn't belong here, not in any sense. But somehow, he had ended up in this place, and now he was fighting for something far bigger than his freedom. He was fighting to uncover the truth. The next day, he made up his mind. He couldn't wait around any longer, hoping for some miracle to fall into his lap. He needed to take matters into his own hands. The key to unlocking this mystery, he thought, lay with Robert. But getting close to Robert wasn't going to be easy. He was a well-known figure among the other inmates, someone who had connections both inside and outside the prison. And from what Carl had told him, Robert wasn't just a random witness. He was part of something bigger. His plan was simple: he would find a way to speak to Robert, and in doing so, he would gather the information he needed to piece together the truth. But how? The guards were always watching, and the last thing he needed was to draw attention to himself. Robert was a dangerous man, and getting too close could be risky. He waited until the evening meal, when the mess hall was crowded and chaotic. That was his chance. The inmates were all too preoccupied with their own problems to pay much attention to anything else. As the loud clatter of trays and voices filled the room, he made his way toward Robert, who was sitting at his usual spot near the back. Robert was eating his meal, a plate of mushy food that didn't resemble anything close to a meal. But he was calm, unfazed by the commotion around him. He approached cautiously, standing a few feet away, making sure not to draw too much attention. When Robert looked up, their eyes met, and for a brief moment, something passed between them. It was an unspoken understanding, a recognition of the tension in the air. He cleared his throat, keeping his voice low. "Robert," he said, trying to sound casual. Robert didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied him, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "You've been asking questions, haven't you?" He didn't reply, but the question lingered in the air. He knew that Robert was aware of his growing suspicions, but this was the first time he had acknowledged it directly. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," he said, his voice steady. "I just want to know the truth." Robert chuckled, but there was no warmth in the sound. "Truth? The truth is a dangerous thing in here. You'd be better off leaving it alone." But that only made him more determined. "I don't think I can," he said, his tone hardening. "Not when I know something's wrong. Not when I know I don't belong here." Robert studied him for a moment, his eyes flicking to the guards, who were milling about, too distracted to notice the quiet exchange between the two men. "I told you before," Robert said, his voice low and almost menacing. "There are things you don't want to know. Things that will change the way you see everything. You're not ready for the truth." He felt a pang of frustration but refused to let it show. "I'm ready. I've been ready for a long time." Robert seemed to consider this for a moment. Finally, he leaned in, his face inches from his own. "You think you're ready? All right. But don't say I didn't warn you. What you're looking for isn't just about you. It's about something bigger. Much bigger." Before he could respond, Robert stood up and walked away, leaving him standing there, more confused than ever. What did Robert mean by bigger? What could possibly be bigger than his own innocence? He didn't have time to dwell on it. His instincts told him to keep digging, to keep pushing forward. There was more to this story, and it wasn't just about a single false conviction, it was about a web of deceit that stretched far beyond the walls of this prison. And he needed to find out where it led. Over the next few days, he continued to observe Robert from a distance, trying to learn more about him, about his connections. He had to be careful. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. But as he watched Robert interact with other inmates, he began to notice something strange. Robert wasn't just a witness in his trial. He was also involved in something else, something more sinister. There were men in the prison who seemed to follow Robert's every move, and some of them had an air of authority that was hard to ignore. It was clear that Robert had ties to powerful people, both inside and outside the prison. One day, he overheard a conversation between two of Robert's associates. They were speaking in hushed tones, but he could make out enough to know that they were discussing something important. "The plan's moving forward," one of them said. "The target's already in place. It's just a matter of time before everything falls into place." He felt his stomach tighten. The target? Was that him? Was he the pawn in some elaborate scheme? He needed to confront Robert. There was no other choice. But he also knew he had to be careful. He couldn't rush into things. He had to play the game, bide his time, and wait for the right moment. That moment came sooner than expected. One evening, as he was walking back to his cell after a long day, he spotted Robert standing alone near the exercise yard, looking out at the horizon. The air was thick with tension, and he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. He had to confront Robert now, before it was too late. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. When Robert saw him, he didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stood there, waiting. "You said I wasn't ready," he said, his voice steady. "But I don't have a choice anymore. I need to know. I need to understand what's going on. What's really happening here?" Robert didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to face him, his eyes cold and calculating. "You want to know the truth?" he asked, his voice laced with warning. "You're not ready for it. You think you are, but you're not." But he refused to back down. "Tell me. Please. I need to know." Robert sighed, his breath heavy with the weight of years of silence. "Fine. But once you know, there's no turning back. You're in this whether you like it or not. This isn't just about you anymore. You've been caught up in something much bigger than you can imagine." And just like that, the truth began to unravel. The conversation with Robert had shifted something deep inside of him. For days, he couldn't shake the sense of dread that had been growing since that moment. Robert's words lingered in his mind, "You've been caught up in something much bigger than you can imagine." He felt the weight of them more with every passing hour. It was like he had been handed a key to a door he wasn't sure he wanted to open. But now, there was no turning back. The tension in the prison seemed to have grown. It wasn't just the usual atmosphere of fear and hostility. This was different. There was a palpable undercurrent of something more sinister, something lurking in the shadows, waiting to reveal itself. Carl had noticed it too. The usual banter in the common areas had turned into hushed conversations, and the guards seemed to be moving with more purpose. It was as if they knew something was about to happen, but they weren't ready to tell anyone yet. The realization hit him hard: the longer he stayed in this place, the deeper the conspiracy seemed to run. The fact that Robert was involved, someone with so many connections, made it clear that this wasn't just about a wrongful conviction. This was about something far more dangerous. But what exactly was it? Carl knew he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. Every instinct told him to keep pressing forward. The truth had become a pull, an unshakable force that demanded to be uncovered. But every step forward seemed to raise more questions than answers. He needed more information, and he needed it fast. The day after his conversation with Robert, Carl found himself pacing in his cell. He couldn't sleep, his mind racing with the possibilities. What was Robert's connection to the men he had overheard talking? And why had he been singled out in the first place? Every scenario felt like it could be the key to understanding this tangled web. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he actually knew about the forces at play. It was a game of shadows, and he was caught right in the middle of it. That's when he heard a faint sound outside his cell door, a soft tap, almost like a knock, but too quiet to be certain. He pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear. The air felt thick, and for the first time in a while, he felt the creeping sensation of someone watching him. He moved to the small barred window of his cell and peered out. The hallway was empty, but there was a faint shadow in the distance. Without thinking, he slipped out of his cell. His heartbeat quickened, and his mind raced as he moved down the corridor, trying to stay hidden in the darkness. The hall was silent except for the distant sound of footsteps, and the low murmur of voices from further down. He had no idea who was out there or what they wanted, but he wasn't about to wait and find out. This wasn't the time to be caught unprepared. He crept through the shadows, his eyes darting from side to side. The footsteps were getting closer, and he had to make a decision fast. He pressed his back against the cold wall, holding his breath. As the figure drew closer, he could finally make out who it was, one of Robert's associates. The man's face was shadowed, but there was no mistaking the cold intensity in his eyes. Carl waited until the man passed, then followed at a safe distance. He wasn't sure where this would lead, but something told him that this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. The man turned a corner, and Carl quickened his pace, just barely keeping him in sight. This wasn't the first time Carl had followed someone through the prison corridors, but it felt different now. This time, there was a sense of urgency in his every step. He couldn't afford to lose track of the man. They eventually reached a secluded part of the prison, an area Carl had never been to before. The walls here were old, the bricks worn down by time and neglect. The man stopped in front of a door that Carl had never noticed. He glanced around before entering, disappearing into the dimly lit room. Carl's heart pounded in his chest as he moved toward the door. He had to know what was going on inside. He waited for a moment, listening for any sounds that might give him a clue. When nothing came, he carefully turned the handle, making sure it didn't creak. The door opened just enough for him to slip inside without making a sound. The room was small and dark, but Carl could make out the shapes of several people sitting around a table, speaking in hushed tones. It took a few moments for his eyes to adjust to the dim light, but when they did, he froze. The men gathered around the table weren't just any inmates. These were the men he had seen in the yard, the ones who had seemed to follow Robert's every move. They weren't just associates, these were the powerful figures he had been trying to understand. The ones with connections that stretched far beyond the prison walls. Carl's breath caught in his throat as he strained to hear their conversation. It was quiet, but the words were clear enough. "Everything's going according to plan," one of the men said. "The connections have been made, and soon, he'll be in the position we need him." Carl felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. They were talking about, was it him? Or was it someone else? And what plan were they referring to? "We can't wait too long," another man spoke up, his voice low and urgent. "The longer this takes, the more risks we're exposing ourselves to. We need to move quickly." "Agreed," the first man replied. "But we need to be sure. The last thing we want is for him to suspect anything. It's too dangerous." Carl could hardly believe what he was hearing. They were talking about him, that much was clear. But what exactly did they want from him? What role was he supposed to play in this web of lies and manipulation? His mind raced as he tried to process the information. They weren't just involved in the wrongful conviction, they were orchestrating something far larger. He had walked right into a conspiracy, and now he needed to figure out how to get out of it. As the men continued to speak in low tones, Carl slowly backed away, making sure not to make a sound. He had to leave before they noticed him, before they knew he had been there. The weight of what he had just uncovered pressed down on him like a heavy stone. There was no way he was going to be able to walk away from this without consequences. He made his way back to his cell, every step feeling heavier than the last. What had he just discovered? What kind of game were these men playing, and how was he supposed to survive it? Once back in his cell, Carl slumped onto his bed, his mind spinning. He had learned something important, but it had only led to more questions. Who were these men really working for? What was the endgame? And how could he possibly get out of this mess alive? The more he thought about it, the more it became clear that he was only beginning to scratch the surface. This wasn't just a fight for his freedom anymore. It was a battle for survival, a fight to expose the truth before it was too late. He had to dig deeper. He had to find a way to uncover everything, even if it meant putting his life at risk. Because one thing was certain, he was no longer just a man fighting for his freedom. He was a man fighting for the truth. And the truth would set him free, or destroy him completely. The walls of the prison had never felt as suffocating as they did now. Carl lay in his small cell, staring up at the cracked ceiling, his mind a whirlpool of thoughts and questions. Every piece of the puzzle he had uncovered so far only seemed to lead him further down a rabbit hole, and he wasn't sure if the truth would be his salvation or his doom. The conversation he had overheard in that dark room with the powerful men had changed everything. He was no longer just a man wrongly convicted of a crime he didn't commit, he was a key player in a game far larger than he could have ever imagined. He had been plunged into the heart of a conspiracy that stretched far beyond the prison walls, and now he had to navigate this dangerous path with nothing but his wits and instincts. There was no one he could trust. Every person, every conversation, every gesture could be a trap set for him. Carl wasn't naive. He knew how things worked in places like this. People didn't just talk about plans without reason. They didn't discuss schemes and power moves unless they intended to act on them. The way the men in that room spoke about him, it was clear they thought of him as a pawn. They didn't care about his innocence. They cared about something else, something much darker and more complicated. He had to find out what it was. The next few days passed in a blur. Carl spent every waking moment trying to piece together the information he had. The men he had seen in that room weren't just influential, they were connected to powerful forces, people who had the means and the will to manipulate the system, to make sure that the truth stayed buried. But why? What was it that they were hiding? What was so important that they had to keep him locked away in this place, miles from the outside world? Carl couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His every move seemed to be under scrutiny. He had always known the guards were suspicious of him, but now it felt different. Their eyes lingered longer, their footsteps echoed louder as they passed by his cell. He didn't know who he could trust anymore. Not the guards. Not the other inmates. Everyone was a potential threat. Then, one morning, Carl was summoned to the warden's office. The summons itself wasn't unusual, prisoners were called in for various reasons all the time. But the fact that it was so sudden, with no explanation, set Carl's nerves on edge. He had a sinking feeling that this wasn't just a routine meeting. When he entered the warden's office, he found the man sitting behind his large desk, the same stern expression on his face that Carl had come to expect over the years. But there was something different this time, something in the warden's eyes. There was a flicker of uncertainty, a hint of fear. It wasn't like the warden to show weakness, and Carl didn't like it. "Sit down," the warden said, his voice sharp and businesslike. "I've received some interesting information about you." Carl didn't sit right away. Instead, he stood, keeping his distance, studying the warden carefully. This wasn't normal. The warden's tone wasn't just professional, it was tinged with something else. Fear. "What kind of information?" Carl asked cautiously. The warden leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of his face. "We know what you've been up to," he said, his voice low. "The people you've been talking to. The conversations you've been overhearing." Carl's pulse quickened. He didn't know how much the warden knew, but it was clear that this wasn't just a routine meeting. When he entered the warden's office, he found the man sitting behind his large desk, the same stern expression on his face that Carl had come to expect over the years. But there was something different this time, something in the warden's eyes. There was a flicker of uncertainty, a hint of fear. It wasn't like the warden to show weakness, and Carl didn't like it. "Sit down," the warden said, his voice sharp and businesslike. "I've received some interesting information about you." Carl didn't sit right away. Instead, he stood, keeping his distance, studying the warden carefully. This wasn't normal. The warden's tone wasn't just professional, it was tinged with something else. Fear. "What kind of information?" Carl asked cautiously. The warden leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of his face. "We know what you've been up to," he said, his voice low. "The people you've been talking to. The conversations you've been overhearing." Carl's pulse quickened. He didn't know how much the warden knew, but it was clear that this wasn't just about his cell or his behavior in the prison. This was bigger. "Who are you talking about?" Carl asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "What do you know?" The warden sighed, rubbing his eyes as though the conversation was wearing him thin. "It doesn't matter," he said finally. "What matters is that you stay out of this. You're in over your head, Carl. And if you don't back off, things are going to get a lot worse for you. You're playing with fire." Carl didn't know what to say. The warden's words didn't make sense. Why would the warden be so concerned about him? The guards and the higher-ups in the prison always had their eyes on the inmates, but this felt different. Something wasn't adding up. "You can't stop what's coming," Carl said, more to himself than to the warden. "I'm not the one you need to be worried about." The warden shot him a warning look. "You're playing a dangerous game, Carl. Don't make it worse for yourself." But Carl wasn't listening anymore. His mind was already racing, trying to figure out the next move. The warden's warning was clear: someone on the outside, or perhaps someone higher up in the prison hierarchy, had a vested interest in keeping him quiet. But who? And why? As Carl was escorted back to his cell, the weight of the situation began to settle on him. He was no longer just fighting for his freedom. He was now fighting for something much more important: the truth. He had to expose whatever dark force was controlling his life, manipulating the system. But how? The days blurred together, and Carl found himself becoming more paranoid by the hour. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the guards. He spent his time studying everyone around him, looking for any sign of who might be involved in this conspiracy. He knew that someone had to be working against him from the inside. But who? And how could he find out? One evening, as he sat in the mess hall eating his meager dinner, Carl noticed something strange. One of the inmates, a man named James, who usually kept to himself, was acting differently. His movements were twitchy, his eyes darting around the room nervously. Carl watched him for a few moments, then decided to approach him. "James," Carl said quietly, leaning in so that only the other man could hear. "What's going on? You're acting strange." James froze, his face going pale. For a moment, Carl thought he had made a mistake, but then the other man leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "They know," James said, his voice shaking. "They know what you've been doing. They're watching you. You're in too deep." Carl's heart skipped a beat. "Who's watching me?" But James just shook his head, his eyes darting nervously toward the guards. "I can't say," he whispered. "I'm just telling you, be careful. There are eyes everywhere." Carl didn't get a chance to ask more questions. James quickly stood up and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of inmates. Carl was left with more questions than answers, his mind racing with the implications of what James had said. He was being watched, more closely than he had ever imagined. But the real question was, who was watching him? And why? Carl's path forward was more dangerous than ever. Every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into the darkness. But he couldn't back down now. He had uncovered too much to walk away. His only choice was to press on, to dig deeper, even if it meant putting his life at risk. Because the truth, Carl knew, was out there. And he would find it, no matter the cost. Carl sat on the edge of his cot, his eyes scanning the grimy walls of his cell. The days had bled together, indistinguishable from one another, the weight of his circumstances pressing down on him with an almost unbearable force. His every breath felt labored, as if the air itself had become thicker, heavier. But through it all, one thought remained steadfast in his mind: he had to keep going. There was no turning back now. Too many people had already sacrificed too much for him to give up. The revelations of the past few weeks had shaken him to his core. The secrets he had uncovered, the hidden players in the game he was now trapped in, they were far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. And yet, despite all the peril, Carl knew that he was on the verge of something monumental. Something that would change everything. The conspiracy was much larger than just his wrongful conviction. It wasn't just about him anymore. The very system that had locked him away was corrupt to its core, riddled with individuals and forces that profited from keeping the truth buried. Carl had seen the men in that dark room, the ones who controlled everything from behind the scenes. They were powerful, untouchable, and they were willing to do anything to keep their secrets safe. But Carl wasn't going to let them get away with it. He had learned more than he could have ever hoped. He had gathered enough information to finally piece together the truth about what was really going on. The scheme that had landed him in prison was just the beginning. The real story, the one they had tried so hard to bury, was far more complex and insidious than he could have ever imagined. And now, he had the key to expose it all. It had all started years ago. His wrongful conviction was just a small part of a much larger plan. Carl had been chosen not because of the crime he had been accused of, but because of the people who had manipulated the evidence to send him to prison. Those men in the room, the ones he had overheard, had been the orchestrators of the entire plot. But they weren't working alone. They were backed by powerful figures, people, influence, and resources to cover their tracks. Carl's thoughts were interrupted when he heard footsteps approaching his cell. He stood up quickly, his heart racing as he wondered who it could be this time. He had grown used to the guards stopping by to check on him, to remind him of his place in the system. But this felt different. There was an urgency in the way the footsteps echoed down the hall. The door to his cell opened, and Carl's breath caught in his throat. Standing there was none other than Robert, the man who had first set him on this dangerous path. "What are you doing here?" Carl asked, his voice sharp with surprise. Robert looked around, making sure no one else was in sight before stepping inside. His face was pale, his eyes wide with an unspoken fear. "We don't have much time," he whispered urgently. "You've been digging too deep. They know everything now. They're coming for you." Carl's mind raced. "Who's coming for me? What do you mean they know everything?" Robert lowered his voice even further, his eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. "The men you overheard, they're part of something bigger than you can possibly understand. This goes all the way to the top, Carl. You've been a pawn in their game for far longer than you realize." Carl clenched his fists, a surge of anger rising within him. "I'm not a pawn. I'm not just going to sit here and wait for them to come for me. I want answers." Robert nodded grimly, his face tight with the weight of everything that had happened. "You're not the only one who wants answers. But you need to get out of here, now. You're in danger, Carl. More than you can imagine." Carl's mind spun. "Get out of here? How am I supposed to do that? I'm locked up. They have me here for life." Robert stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "You don't have much time. The people who have been controlling your life, the ones behind this whole mess, they're about to make their move. But you can still stop them. You have the truth. You have the power to expose them, if you can get out of here alive." Carl's eyes narrowed. "How do you know all of this?" "I've been part of their plan for years," Robert confessed. "But I couldn't stand by anymore. I couldn't be complicit in what they were doing. I helped set you up, Carl. I'm sorry." Carl's breath hitched. The betrayal cut deep, but there was something else in Robert's eyes, something that told him the man wasn't lying now. "So what's the plan?" Robert's face was tight with anxiety. "There's a way out, but it's risky. I've arranged for you to be transferred to another facility. It's a long shot, but it's the only chance you have to get out and expose them. Once you're out, you need to take what you've learned and make it public. People need to know the truth." Carl's mind was racing. The plan sounded too good to be true, but Robert's urgency was clear. There was no time to waste. "How do I get out? How do I trust you after everything?" Robert looked at him, his eyes full of regret. "I know I've done a lot of wrong, Carl. But right now, you're my only hope. You're the only one who can stop them. You're the key to everything." Carl studied him for a long moment, weighing his options. He had come too far to back down now. He was in too deep to turn around. The choice was clear. "I'll do it," Carl said. "But I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for me. For the truth." Robert nodded, his face a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Good. You have to be ready. There's no turning back after this. The people we're up against, they'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets." Carl's eyes hardened with resolve. "Then I'll make sure they don't get away with it." Robert gave him a last, lingering look before slipping out of the cell, leaving Carl alone with his thoughts. The plan was set. There was no going back now. Carl didn't sleep that night. He couldn't afford to. He spent the hours in his cell, going over every detail, trying to anticipate what might go wrong. The stakes had never been higher. If he failed, he would be dead, no questions asked. The next morning, Carl was called to the warden's office. The tension in the air was thick as he was escorted down the hall, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what was going to happen, but he was ready. This was it. The moment of truth. As he entered the warden's office, he noticed something was different. There was no one else in the room. The warden was standing by the window, staring out at the prison yard. "You've been causing quite a stir, Carl," the warden said without turning around. His voice was calm, but Carl could hear the underlying threat. "I'm just trying to survive," Carl replied coolly, his eyes never leaving the warden's back. The warden turned slowly, a sly smile spreading across his face. "You think you're the only one who's been playing a game here? You're a pawn, Carl. Nothing more." Carl's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid anymore. "We'll see about that." In that moment, Carl knew the battle wasn't just for his freedom. It was for the truth. And no matter what it cost him, he was going to fight for it. The final piece of the puzzle had been set in motion. The walls that had kept Carl locked away were about to come crashing down.